Yes,
Let me
perfect.
know. Yeah. Answer. All right. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening again. So when Megha reached out and a few other folks that I'm very familiar with out here reached out, I kind of thought it might be interesting to speak, and then what would be the topic I'd talk about. And I myself transitioned from an engineer to a product manager for on-premises products to a product manager for enterprise SaaS products, and looking at my transition, my learnings for certain things that I kind of picked up along the way, certain things that I saw by listening to others talk. And so I thought maybe that might be something I could share that others might find useful. So we're here to talk about that. So Menika already gave an introduction. I worked in a whole bunch of companies. I worked at Sun for 10 years until the company closed down, I guess. So I was an engineer for a long time, mostly focused on infrastructure software. I did everything from storage to kernel to tools, all that kind of stuff. Transitioned over to product management in 2008, right around the time when I graduated from MIT. I've done multiple PM leadership roles, PM roles, and around 2014 or so, kind of moved from a completely on-prem to something that had a pretty big cloud component when I was doing the startup Zero Stack with a few of my co-founders. So today I work at Slack. I kind of lead product for our core infrastructure and data. And I can talk about some of those learnings. Slack, for those who don't know, is a business communication platform. We have this notion of a channel-based messaging where you create a channel and you add users and you work there, you collaborate there. And if a new person shows up, you can just add that person to that channel and that person can come up to speed on what's going on. These channels can be tied to a host of applications, whether it be your, things like Jenkins and Jira or your own business app. And that way you can do a lot of work from Slack itself as opposed to constantly going through other tools, etc. And so we've been growing pretty fast, around 12 million. Actually, it's more than 12 million, but last time 12 million plus daily active users used by more than 50% of the Fortune 100 companies, and our users are kind of divided across the world in 150 countries. So that's kind of the business side. On the technology side, and the reason I'm talking about this is that's important. How to scale a business that comes into effect when we are talking about how many customers you have, how your systems are being used, etc. So we're like 150 million messages kind of sent per minute at peak hours, right? Users spend a pretty decent amount of time on Slack. We have a whole bunch of apps that are integrated. Customers build their own integrations, and we have a whole bunch of developers, whether they are inside the company, who have their custom apps and integrating those apps with Slack, etc. And in terms of the volume of data, think of it as Twitter scale for the enterprise. It's kind of at that level. So this is not about Slack. This is about other things. So I just wanted to talk about, first start with some very basic difference between on-premise and SaaS products. And because I only know software, this is mostly related to software. So pardon me. Hopefully along the way you can learn even if you're not in the software IT field. So let's talk a little bit about on-premises versus SaaS, right? I think this is just a very basic answer. Like in the case of on-premises, software usually is delivered, by a company that is kind of building it. They have versions of it. They sell it. You can either download it, or in the olden days, you'd get a CD with that software, or a DVD with the software. So it's delivered. The customer is responsible for kind of running it. The customer is responsible for upgrading it, doing all of those things. And good examples of that kind of software, you have VMware, vSphere, where I worked for about a good less than 4 years, SAP, Oracle Financial, all this ERP stuff, all of that, the pre-Salesforce CRM, like all of that just kind of on-premise software. Or even if you look at custom software that companies or developers might develop in-house for their company's IT needs. And then SaaS is software is kind of an important part, but the more important part is kind of the service that is delivered along with it, which means the vendor is responsible for running it. The vendor is responsible for the upgrades, etc. As a customer, you point to a browser or to a mobile device and just use that software. You don't have to worry about where it's running, how many machines are needed to run it, how to scale it. You don't have to worry about any of those things. And some good examples like Salesforce was kind of the very first software as a service. In fact, their logo was like no software. I think they still use that from time to time. Then you have, these days everybody uses Zoom, Office 365, like Slack, Okta, Box, Zendesk. I think from India you have Freshdesk, because that was a pretty good competitor to Zendesk. And then Zoho, that's a CRM software. All of those. These are good examples. Now, I've asked this question, like, what about Adobe? This is kind of a little funny. Adobe uses, if you look at Adobe, what they do is a lot of Adobe software actually runs on your desktop, on your machine, whether it's your laptop or desktop, and they have changed the way you purchase and use it, in the sense they measure, instead of you buying that software, paying a license and buying it and using it forever and sharing it with your friends, etc. They have made the delivery of that software very SaaS-based. You have to go to their website, you have to pay money and download it, and then it runs on your machine. After that, so that's sort of an update, etc. But so it's kind of this, not really SaaS. It's just that the way it's being delivered and measured, etc., is as a service. So that's why I kind of bring up Adobe. It's a little interesting. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So the fact that there is this huge difference in the way the software, the service is delivered, who runs it, who is responsible for it, all of that stuff, and also the type of businesses that launch or offer their product via SaaS has huge implications on quite a few things. So one of them is the engineering implication. Like, how do you build, how do you run, how do you do all of that stuff? Then there is kind of the go-to-market implication. I'll talk about that. And then the third one is like, how do you scale this thing as your business grows? Like, what are the things that might be important to do? So these are some of the kind of purely based on personal experience. So let's look at the first one. So this was something that I learned very early on after we moved to, after coming to Slack, actually, which is SaaS, especially SaaS at scale, feels a little bit like you own a stadium that is under perpetual construction, but you need to host a game every day with lots of customers, lots of spectators coming in. Right. So that's pretty much it, right? You're constantly doing things, you're adding new features, you're doing all of that. All of these things must still keep that service up and running to users who are using it. Because it's not every user for themselves or every customer for themselves. And so this has huge implications on software development, maintenance, how you organize your teams, what kind of teams do you have, etc. So Menika, a question: do we take these any Q&A afterwards, or is that the best forum?
Yeah, we can take this afterwards. Yes.
All right. So, like, first lesson, right? I mean, this is pretty trivial. Issues at a single customer usually impact only that customer if it's an on-premise, whereas in the case of SaaS, issues at a single customer can impact many more customers. So a good example, right? When I was at VMware, you'd have a very large Wall Street bank trying to install 10,000 VMs, and they'll run into some scale issues or something, and there'll be a whole set of problems, and we'd go and talk to that customer, our customer support folks would talk to them, etc. But that problem was still constrained to just to that particular customer. In the SaaS world, let's and I'm just picking on Zendesk. I don't have any bones to sing against them. But let's say, suddenly they have a user who decides to provision 100,000, hundreds of thousands of users. That's not unknown. Like that happens in a very large company. And then, that part of Zendesk maybe doesn't scale very well. And what happens, it breaks Zendesk. Not only so now, not only is this customer impacted, a whole bunch of other customers, right? And although Twitter is not an enterprise SaaS company, but the problems are similar, right? That in the early days of Twitter, when you had a celebrity tweet something, then this massive retweets and likes and all of that would kind of bring their infrastructure to would create lots of problems and affect everybody else that was using Twitter at that time, right? So things like that. So the one person or one customer doing something could affect a whole bunch of other customers, and that's very important in how you design, how you lay out, how you deploy stuff, etc. Software glitches, right? So you release a version of software and somebody downloads it and runs it, and if there's a glitch, the first few set of people, the early adopters would face it, and then others would not. So that's why you often hear like, hey, I'm not going to download version 7 of the OS, I'm going to wait for 7.1 so that all the early problems have been fixed, sort of thing. Whereas in the case of SaaS, if there's a glitch, it pretty much affect a lot of people. It could, because you run it in a multi-tenant world where all of the customers are being served, from kind of the same software or the same deployment, or a large set of customers are being served from the same deployment. So, for example, this has happened in my life multiple times where a developer, has just introduced a bug because the QA process did not catch that bug, and that bug essentially brought the site down, and it affected everybody, right? So that's a good example. So as a result of the previous two, I think one of the things that all these SaaS companies do in one way or the other, especially the ones that release software much more frequently, is kind of have these layers of release, like it's staggered release. Like obviously, you write your code, you have the build artifact, then there's a staging environment where you stage it, run some tests, and prior to that, you would have done some local testing in your dev environment, et cetera, and then you usually have a dog food tier, like a small set of customers, maybe some free customers, maybe you're running your own version, like your tenancy runs in that, this company's tenancy runs in the dog food tier. And then you kind of have, deployed to all of your other larger customers. Like you deploy it in tiers. And at the very end, even in the main standard production tier, you don't deploy everything, to all the customers at once. You kind of roll it out in stages, and what we call it canary deploy, or a percentage-based rollout. Like I'm going to release it to 5% of my users, and I'm going to release it to like 10%, 20%, 25, 50. So let's say a single bug that's been fixed and being released across the board, it might take a good hour to hour and a half to release it to everybody, because you take, slowly you add more, you release it to more users, and you kind of measure, is any graph looking really bad? Have I brought down some part of the system, or has performance gone down in certain other part, right? So that's one. The other aspect of it is, usually enterprise customers, what we've found, tend to be not super happy, getting releases, very quickly, or getting things that are like, usually they tend to be the ones who are paying the most money, so you want to make sure that you get them the most, they get the most reliable version of something. And so, the release process also, we see kind of, you first roll it out to free customers, then to kind of the lower end SKUs, like, standard, and then to the next set of the next higher SKU, and then finally to your very large enterprises, etc. So kind of that's another element of kind of the progressive release. So that is very important. Like for example, at Slack, we release about 8 to 9 times a day. So every hour there's a release going out. Like let's say 10 or 20 check-ins make a release, and then we roll it out, and we roll it out this way. The same thing happens in a place like Facebook and some other companies where the release happens fairly quickly, in quick succession. And we need to make sure that the release is stable, that customers are not getting buggy stuff. And so you need to have various gates to kind of catch that. And so this is how we can go about it. The other thing is the lesson learned. Like, I mean, if you back in the days, I'd say, even at VMware, like if you're selling software in the traditional on-premises, normally, you release a version maybe once a year or once every 6 months, and then you have, patch releases, etc. And like when I first spoke to folks at Salesforce, like even for SaaS, they release once every 4 months. Right? So different companies have different release cadences. What's happening, I see a kind of an evolution towards releasing as quickly as possible or as little as possible at any given point in time. So at Slack, for instance, I said we have 6 to 8 releases a day. Similarly, in companies like Facebook, we release very quickly. And the idea is that if you release smaller pieces, then it is easier to identify issues when things go bad and roll back. So that's the philosophy of releasing deploy to production multiple times a day. Yeah. And then kind of a side effect to that is that you can't have a huge QA team doing QA for days before you release. QA has to be baked into the release process. So so testing is part of the deploy workflow. Test-driven development is key, where developers are themselves writing test cases, right? So that's the thing. The thing to note out here is that what I've seen by and large is this does not correlate one-to-one with feature velocity or speed of developing new features and rolling out new features. So that has to do more with kind of the size of the company. And as a company grows, generally it slows down a little bit because there are many more teams, many more pieces of software that need to work with one another, and so that usually takes a little longer over time. Okay, lesson 3. I think so. If you are responsible for not just the software, but maintaining that service, deployment, making sure it's up and running, and all of that stuff, reliability is your headache now, right? Keeping that site up is your headache as a vendor. And so reliability engineering becomes an important thing. Like, if you're a non-SaaS company, you have your typical software engineers development team, you have QA team, they've tested and then they ship it. And then you can wash your hands off for the most part. But here, you need it to run on a daily basis, manage it. So reliability engineering, and this notion of an SRE or a site reliability engineer, that's a very critical role, right? Almost all the companies that we talk to, our peers here, have this SRE role. And we also have somebody, a role called DRE, like database reliability engineers, because a lot of, the other services, their needs are kind of different from the skill set needed to manage, scale a database, right? The other thing that I've seen is, an incident can happen anytime, like whether somebody checks in a bug, somebody checks in some buggy code, or some customer is doing something. Incidents can happen, in multiple ways, multiple times. The ability to detect an incident quickly, kind of gather around it and fix it is key, because that one incident might be preventing more than one customer from connecting to the system, from using the service, etc. Right? So you need to have a very well-defined process around incident detection, remediation, etc. We have this notion of incident commanders at Slack. Their role is to call an incident, etc. Whenever that happens, all those things, right? And the other thing is that the software development teams, the engineers themselves, are responsible for the upkeep of their services, because if the site reliability engineers are not able to address some things, or something needs deep attention, they'll just go to the engineer. So you have these on-call rotations where you have your engineering teams or engineers on these on-call rotations. Like, that's a very common phenomenon. Okay, the other thing, so this is something that when I was on the other side, selling cloud to people, then multi-cloud was the thing I used to always talk about. Like, oh, it's a good thing, it's great, etc. You should spread out your thing. What happens if this cloud goes bad, and things like that. Especially when I was doing zero stack, where we were building software, and the customer already had some cloud running. We wanted to make sure they wanted to buy our stuff, and so we said multi-cloud is the way to go. You should not have one cloud and all of that. So that's great when you're trying to sell a cloud solution. But if you're building with respect to SaaS, like if you're building, hosting, running a SaaS solution, I mean, really, do you want to get into that complexity of having to deploy your stuff in, like, let's say, Amazon and Azure and Google and all of these places just for the heck of it? Like, why? I think so. So you should ask that question: that do you really need to test all these different and run in all these different types of clouds? Are your needs being met, not being met by just deploying in one cloud, right? Like, your customers are not paying for the infrastructure you run on. As long as your stuff runs and you're able to deliver the quality, reliability, etc., by and large, they're not going to ask you, oh, do you run it on this cloud versus that cloud? Some big customers do ask as you grow really big, but by and large, they don't. Your developers, your engineers who are deploying this stuff, your SRE folks, learning a single tool is better than having to learn multiple tools. Also, these clouds, the underlying architecture can be fundamentally different. So if you kind of do this whole performance tuning, etc., of your system in one cloud, it might work out in one way. In another cloud, you might have to tweak things, tune it slightly differently, right? Also, your job is to get your product features out of the door, right? If you can use cloud services that helps you get your features out of the door faster, you should do that. Like, for example, is it really worthwhile to deploy your own Kafka, to get your own queues and all of that stuff? Maybe it's too early for that. Maybe you don't need that scale and management headache on yourself. Maybe can you just use, SQS service, the query service, the queuing service from the cloud vendor that you're using, right? That sort of thing. So these are certain reasons, like when you are running a SaaS business, multi-cloud really doesn't apply as much. Like, data migration, at least that's been in my experience. Now, clearly, there could be a lot of situations where it is super important, right? The areas where I found it's important is like, sometimes we need to make sure your product is data residency compliant, where data lives in a certain part of the world. For example, if you want to offer this product to large banks in Switzerland, they will mandate that all the data live in Switzerland. So maybe you need to run a service there. And if your cloud vendor doesn't have an offering there, then we'll have to think, like, I need to go to some other cloud vendor, that sort of thing. And also, if you want to do remote replication and there isn't, this cloud vendor doesn't have a data center in the location where you want to do replication, that's another time where you might consider a different cloud vendor and things like that. All right, so that was some of the engineering impacts. I'm sure there are a lot more. I just thought of a few out here. So let's talk a little bit about go-to-market. So this is kind of you have a product, and how are you taking that product to the market? Like, how are you selling it to your customers? What kind of capabilities, etc. How to think about those for a SaaS product. So I think one thing that I've seen that works quite a bit is as SaaS evolved, kind of the selling model also evolved. A more traditional selling model had, in any type of sales, in software sales, there's this concept of building a pipeline or a funnel. And these are, you beg, borrow, steal, get, a roller deck of names of IT leaders who could buy your product. You call them up, you have an internal sales team, and then you kind of establish a relationship with them. And let's say, you get 100 of those names, and so by the time, like, you can end up selling to like 2 of them. So that's called the building a funnel. Like, you start with a large funnel, and then you eventually go down to, and you actually sell that thing to a very small set of those customers or prospects that you've built a relationship with, right? And that's a pretty hard job. And there are, and sales teams have these internal sales. You often hear the word ISR. Like, company like Oracle, I think, has an army of ISRs, if I remember when I was working there. Like, they all sit in Austin, Texas, and they keep on calling customers and building that sales channel, that sales funnel. But in the case of SaaS, it's slightly different. What I'm noticing, and what a lot of companies do, is they use their product to build the sales funnel. And the way you do that is make your product available for free, and make it, certain features usable for free for a pretty long time, or for, certain periods of time. And that's when, users come, they start using the product, and maybe, the central IT does not come, but a business unit, or that for whom the product is more useful, comes. For example, I'll give you, in the case of Slack, for instance, what we've noticed is that the technology teams are usually the first ones to adopt Slack. They really like the way it works. They really like the way they can integrate it with, with the tools that they use on a daily basis. And then as they start using it, more and more people in the company use it, other groups start using it, and that's how it grows. And then, at some point, we go and talk to central IT and kind of sell it in a traditional enterprise way. And so, so using your product to build a sales funnel like that. So that plays a good, you need to think about that in terms of what kind of SKUs do you have? What's the free SKU? What's the paid SKU look like? How are the features divided between free and paid, and maybe an enterprise, right? All of those things. And I think one of the key learnings for me is, like, if you can't get your customers to use your product when it's free, like, how do you expect them to actually pay and use it? Like, if they're not using it when it's free, like, why would they pay for it? Right? I think that's another piece that's important. The other lesson, especially as you're kind of maturing, or you want to sell to, to the enterprise grade customers, I think compliance and security does sell. If your product, if customers like your product, there will be many customers who really like your product, but will not be able to make a purchase unless you have certain compliance and security built in, right? So it's very important to understand what those are and build them out. And so these are some things, what I've realized is, for example, certain companies are, certain customers would insist on proper role-based access control, role-based management, role-based administration. Like, if you don't have that, and if your product is like very open, where pretty much everybody can do everything, it will not, in a truly enterprise setting, it will not do very well. It will not, sell. Like, you'll be blocked by kind of the IT admins of that company, right? Things like that. So what we found, like location of the data, like for mobile, what's the mobile strategy? How do you secure it on a mobile? How do you make sure data can't be pulled out? Data loss prevention, e-discovery, these kind of things. I don't think oftentimes you don't have to kind of make these or build this in the product. There are lots of partners or lots of other companies that deliver these kind of capabilities. Just integrating with them, at least one or a couple, makes your product more enterprise grade and kind of sellable in that market. Okay, so this is another learning that it probably applies. It actually applies to both on-prem and SaaS products. And I see people making that mistake quite often. And that's why I want to kind of call it out here. Like, you might think, like, when we would, like, I've done many, things from scratch, built many products, and as a product manager and my engineering team, we think like we've built the next best thing to slice bread. Like, we've built the best damn product. We always feel that, and we need to feel that, to kind of build our product to kind of go all the way. But your customer may not feel that way, and especially, when it comes to how is their life going to change because of this product that you're trying to sell them. Like, they may really like your product, but if in order to use that product, they have to, go through hoops and hurdles, then they're more unlikely to use your product. And so one of the problems I've seen is, so the key that I call it, like, disrupt your competition, not your customer. And one of the ways I see is, like, if you're trying to replace an existing product and adding some more functionality, like, it's really important that the customer be able to bring their existing data and artifacts or whatever, import that into this new one. So I'll give you an example from VMware, right? One of the most popular products at VMware was this thing called P2V. It's called physical to virtual. A sales engineer wrote a little tool that would take a snapshot of a physical machine and kind of copy that and create a virtual machine out of it. And so all these admins who bought few licenses of VMware, they were so happy that they were able to take some servers that each server was being used by one user, and they were not really utilizing that server, just take its footprint and create a VM out of it. And so the end user was not getting disrupted at all. And the admin was able to consolidate those workloads into a smaller set of machines, right? If you are going to, offer a solution that is, let's say, better than Jira to a customer who has Jira, that customer will almost 100% ask that they be able to bring all their Jira bugs over to this new product. They're suddenly not going to say that, I'm going to create all my bugs again in this new product, right? So that's a good example. Yeah. And then the other thing is, if a customer is using, whole sets of other tools, then with your product, they should be able to continue to use those tools. I think so. That's important. So it is very important. I think this is one of the things that kills many companies or prevents them from going mainstream. Okay, so we talk about go-to-market, we talk about engineering, a little bit about expansion and scale. So you have a product, it's a SaaS product. It's you have some customers, you want to grow, add more customers. You want to sell to more customers. You want to add more customers. They could be free. So I think, how do you go about it? One of the things that you realize about SaaS, especially even if it's enterprise SaaS and it's used by a lot of customers, like companies like Box, Dropbox, Zendesk, Slack, these kind of companies, right? You don't get to talk to all the customers because you have a lot of customers, and these customers are just signing up and using it in some corner of the world. You don't have any resources that they don't really want to talk to you. Also, maybe they're just trying out your product to see all of that stuff. So, but you still need to know what this customer is up to, what hurdles are they facing, what are they doing, why are they not doing something that you want them to do, all of those things, right? So I think for that, data is like really, really important. When I say data, I mean the data that you can collect about the behavior of these customers, what they're trying to do in your product, that is very important, right? So that's how you are essentially meeting your customers, through interactions with your product. So that robust data collection analytics is a must, right? And you need to kind of build that data collection pipeline very early as part of building your product, right? And there also, if you're collecting all of this, then you can actually engage in a more data-driven feature development as far as possible. Obviously, if you're building a product you're creating, or you are, you already have a product and you add more features. A lot of these things you will be like, you brainstorm and come up with new features, etc., by looking at the market. But you'll be surprised at the amount of innovation you can do by looking at how your customers are using the product today. So one of the things, right? You have a product, you have customers using it, and typically it flows through some sort of marketing or through word of mouth. They come to your website where your product is, right? In the case of Slack, it's like slack.com. Now from there, they go through a journey before they click on buy or a trial or what have you, right? Now there could be multiple paths that take you from coming to the website to this trial, to this thing, because you don't know what kind of behavior they have. You might be coming from different what's it called, marketing campaigns, etc., all of that stuff, right? So knowing where, kind of what is the path that these users are taking towards the buy button or to start registration button, and kind of removing the barriers. Like, I think that's something that's a lesson that what I've realized is very, very important. Right? So that's something that you should be good at, should be able to do this. And that's where data helps, like, so that's something. For example, if somebody signs up, right? First of all, at if they don't sign up, like at which page or at which page in the build out process or in their navigation do they drop off, right? Like, why do they drop off there? Can you make some tweaks there and see if less people drop off, things like that, right? And then after let's say if they're if they've signed up for free usage, right? How are they using their product in the first week? Like, are they, that's in the case of Slack, are they sending messages or are they not? For some other product, like if it's like something like Zendesk, like have they created a ticket? Have they not? Right? Can you correlate that to a future purchase decision they'll make, etc.? Right. The other thing is, maybe in certain cases, if you don't have a mobile version of your product, then nobody's going to buy it, or maybe one or two, it'll never be used, or nobody's going to pay for it because that particular customer or that type of customer, or in that country, having a mobile device is more prevalent than having a desktop or a laptop, right? So this is kind of very key, knowing what your customer is doing. How do you get them from coming to your website to registering? And anything you can do in that direction will be very helpful. And most companies have dedicated teams that deals with this problem, that just solves this problem, right? Again, I'm saying, like, and this is, you'll hear this term growth hacker, right? So these companies, if you're doing SaaS, you need to invest in an expansion team, and that team's sole mission is, make tweaks, whatever tweaks is needed in the product and user experience, so that more users sign up and more users continue to use the product after they've signed up. Because only then are they going to actually make a purchase in case it was a free sign up, or continue using and renew the license, etc. Remember, these are customers that you don't have an active sales team reaching out and talking to them, etc. Right? They are the part of your customer base that's helping build the funnel. A subset of those will go on to become large enterprise customers, right? That sort of thing. And then, so one of the things that happens very commonly is deploying features via experiments. You want to make a tweak and you roll it out to 5% of your customer base, and you make another tweak and you roll it out to another 5%, and the remaining 90% keep on offering the slightly older feature set kind of thing. And so that's, and then you look at the experiment and you see how it's behaving, if it is changing any of the metrics that you're measuring, and then if that experiment is successful, you roll it out across your product line, right? That sort of thing. So this is very important. I think this one was my learning, the last few years, I'd say 3-4 years. Like, it's really there's no value in at least initially in the first 4 or 5 years, like planning for a really large number of users, or thinking that, oh, my business is going to be like really big one day, and so I need to plan for it now. Like, no, you don't need to plan for it now. If you don't have 10 customers, then what's the point in thinking about 10 million customers, right? So, and this kind of plays along all the angles, right? The first version of the software that you've written can actually be pretty lousy, but as long as it meets the needs, has the features that users care about, and and can deal with scales up to 1,000 customers, and each customer of a certain size, that's good. And then as your product gets used more and more, more users show up or larger customers show up, then you need to scale. There's no need to kind of do that super early. I mean, obviously the idea is that when you're building software, you're following the usual software engineering principles. There's decent separation of concerns, etc., so that if you want to add you add more scale, you can kind of do that, right? So in the case of Slack, for instance, right, we start out supporting smaller customers use Slack at the very beginning, right? Then we started getting slightly larger customers. Then we got our first 10,000 size customer. Oh my God, things will fall apart. And then we kind of addressed that. Then we got our our 100,000 size customer, and then we kind of scaled to that need as we were getting understanding what the issues were there. And then now a customer that is itself like 1 million users, and kind of making sure that all the parts. And along these, like there is kind of the element of designing the software, engineering for scale. There's also kind of running the business for scale. Right? Both these sides need to be taken care of. The other thing is that there is no prize for building the best software stack. Like you don't get any prize for that. And if you look at some of the most successful software companies, like their stack is pretty simple. Like if you look at Salesforce, they still use an Oracle database to store all their data, and they've written some business logic to kind of deal with that state, and they've deployed it in pods. It is pretty simple, but it does the work that everybody needs, the customers need from them. That's all. All right, so that was kind of the top 10 that I could remember. I'm sure if I were to come up with this list like a month from now or a year before, I'd probably come with a slightly different top 10, but this is my top 10 today. So the key insights is, like I said, the best software stack does not make the best SaaS product. Like, let's be very clear about that. I think in SaaS, development, infrastructure, operations, they're all intertwined. They're all tied together. Your developers are also keepers of your infrastructure. The keepers of your infrastructure are also writing code to keep that up. Operations, so that's kind of all together. And data is really important, right? You need to leverage data as much as possible, for your needs. So I believe, okay. And there's something that I read from time to time that I find useful. There's a whole bunch of others that are there, but these are a few that I could remember. So there's this gentleman called Guy Raz. He runs a podcast about how I built this. So he interviews CEOs and founders of how they went and built their product, successful CEOs and founders, how they scale their product. And you listen to some of that, you can see like how they started. One of the things that comes across pretty clearly is that they were not planning that I'm going to be super successful 10 years from now. They were planning, how can I get a product to market faster? How can I get my feature out sooner? And how can I get a complete feature, however small, in small chunks and kind of. So that's something. There's a Masters of Scale podcast that a lot of has some good interest in information. Then there's this weekly, a daily email that comes from Strategic. You should go to this site. It's a paid service, but it's actually very good for practicing product managers. I found that. That's all I had for now. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
Great, Ratandeep. Thank you so much. We have received many questions here. Thank you so much for your time on explaining these concepts to us. So there is one question from Amit Sharma. When it comes to SaaS product, how is dog food tier introduced as same URL may be accessed by all?
Yeah, so good question. So I think the customer doesn't know that he or she is in a dog food tier. It's you know it's a multi-tenant system. So in the same, your underlying deployment, your system is supporting all of these customers, and each customer has a unique ID, right? And so you know which customer, you know how to differentiate you as the person running or as the company running that SaaS product. And so you can determine that these X number of customers, I'm going to call them, put them in the dog food tier. So you have your software deployment, you have your, let's say a part of your a slice of your deployment stack as the dog food tier. And when requests come in, you have the same global, load balancers, etc. But when requests come in after that, they are redirected to that slice of the infrastructure. So that's how we kind of do it. So the customer doesn't know anything about it. Next.
Thank you. The next one is, where does the value lie for SaaS applications? If these applications are to help business work effectively, efficiently, should we try minimizing time spent on applications or increase time spent there?
So I think it really depends on the application, right? I would say how effectively you can use your time. So let's just take Zendesk, right? People use that to file tickets. Now it's a completely SaaS application. Now the act of using Zendesk, now clearly, you don't want to file tickets the whole day, right? So it is not your goal to go and be on Zendesk the whole day. But when you want to file a ticket, or when you want to talk to whoever you file the ticket against, like that conversation, the act of filing a ticket, the ability to upload logs, etc., should be you should be able to do it with ease. So I don't think spending time on an application is a measure of effectiveness in many applications. But in other cases, it is like, if I am a salesperson, or if I'm doing my daily work, right, I would spend a lot of time on emails and Slack or whatever, because that's where I'm doing my work, right? Versus if I'm filing a ticket is not my regular work. That's kind of a side effect of my work. So it depends on the app.
Thank you. I hope you got your answer, Tarun. Sankita Kataria has a question. Which analytics platform do you use at Slack, and which one do you recommend for tracking user behavior and funnels and data points?
Yeah. So at Slack, because of the scale, we've kind of built our own, ETL pipeline. So what we do is, we take all the database, the tables, all the logs that so our clients, generate a lot of logs, whether it's the desktop, etc. We take those logs, we ingest it into, a Kafka, and then we kind of do. We have written our own, what's it called? Something called extracting software called Scooper. We use that to scoop that data. We put it into, S3 in the form of Parquet files, and then we use Airflow with Spark and Hadoop, to kind of process that. And then on the other side, we have our own software for visualization as well as for rolling out experiments. But I've seen people, I think a lot of it is pretty common, like the whole Kafka ingestion mechanism, or the ability to read from a SQL database into a data lake like an S3, and from where you kind of run these big data processing systems, whether it's Spark or EMR, Spark or Hadoop. and then you have a query mechanism. Now, if the volume of data is not that much, you could potentially use something like Snowflake, or there's a whole bunch of stuff. And then for visualization, people use things like from Tableau, Looker, all of those kind of tools for visualization of that data. So I think you can have a pretty standard stack if the volume of data is under control. But if you have a very large amount of data like we do at Slack or in places like Twitter, you're kind of forced to build some of your own systems. That's what we've done with some open source components.
Great. Thank you. Here is a question from Prashant. In progressive delivery, should the customer segment be based on customer type, that is innovators, early adopters, late adopters, etc.?
Not really. That doesn't. So I'll give you an example, right? So if you're selling to an enterprise and they want the most stable version, and you want to make it available to them last in my progressive delivery picture. But in that enterprise company, there are a small set of people who are responsible for, let's say, rolling out Slack to the entire company. And so what they say is, oh, we want to have a sandbox account where we get to see the features faster before the rest of our company does. So maybe that sandbox tenancy that we have created for them, we will roll out to that faster before the rest of the company gets it, sort of thing. So even within the same company, a small set of people might be getting it earlier. So I wouldn't tie it to the kind of the place where you are in the innovation cycle.
Great, thank you. Here is a question from Vishal. Vishal is a product manager responsible for managing a SaaS-based product. Here is his question. We have many features catering to many themes, which we have shortlisted in our roadmap. Themes could be customer obsession, UI, UX revamp, new features, etc. But when it comes to prioritization, how would you suggest we prioritize features across these themes?
Yeah, it's a very hard question to answer, right? Because without accounting on it. But so I think here's the way I've seen it. There are things that you build to sell more, to kind of reach new markets or new features that you think will get you more customers, more money, etc. Like there is that part. And then there are things that you do to pay down technical debt. And as your product evolves, you will have to pay technical debt because, like I said, you're going to build something very quickly to get to market sooner. And as your product is growing, as your customer base is growing, you realize that that architecture that you did early may be pretty bad. It doesn't work anymore, sort of thing, right? So I think being able to effectively balance between where you need to pay the technical debt, like sometimes you just need to suck it up and pay your technical debt, and being able to have resources to actually add new capabilities that deliver value to your end customers, that lets you grow your revenue. I think you have to strike that balance, and you should always be thinking about you should always be thinking about from a revenue perspective, like is this thing going to increase my revenue, or is this feature going to stop certain churns? Maybe some customers will not renew licenses if I don't have this capability. So that becomes super important, right? And then certain other things like on the technical debt side, right? You have very large customers, and they have certain security and compliance needs, and your operating system needs to be of a certain level, whatever, some upgrade, some patch. You have to do those things. There's no question. Right? So it's kind of a balance between what I've seen. It's kind of a balance between new features, product development, etc., and then technical debt.
Thank you. So Vishal, I see that you have some very important questions to ask Deep, but for the lack of time, we are not able to incorporate all your questions right here. But I suggest that you put these questions on our LinkedIn thread so that we can, depending on Deep's convenience, we can get it answered by Deep. Or if he is okay with it, you can directly connect with him. Deep, looks like Vishal has a lot of questions,
Sure.
which your help would add so much of value to him. So let's move on to another question. Akanksha is asking, which model is deemed suited for the go-to-market of an MVP, where the objective is to gain the attention of the early adopters?
Yeah. So, I mean, early adopters. If you're going out with a new product, the people you will be talking to are the early adopters. Like nobody else will talk to you, right? So pretty much the features that you plan are, I think, the most important thing. Like I remember when we were doing Zero Stack and we took it from a slide deck to a real product, the goal was, what's the difference? What is so different about our offering? I think that needs to come through. Your early adopters are usually tech savvy people who are able to do certain, who are able to see, they're fine if your product has a few bugs, all of that stuff, as long as it has some innovation, something new about it. So I think, if you are going out to market with a new product, then there better be something novel about it. That is going to kind of raise the interest or pique the interest of the early adopters.
Great. Thank you. So let's take one last question from Melvi Miranda. What strategies you would use for identifying blockers? Any advice on avoiding obvious pitfalls and devising effective A/B testing?
Yeah, that's a hard question. So like it depends on the nature of the blockers, right? So let's take the second part first, like devising effective A/B testing. I think one of the things about A/B testing is you should be able to slice and dice customers based on your needs, and that could change from day to day or experiment to experiment. And so, having an A/B testing platform that lets you, slice and dice. Like I want to roll it out to 2% of users who are in Japanese locale, versus I want to roll it out to X% who are from the Americas or of a certain SKU. I think you should be able to slice and dice it any way you want, and your experiment framework should be able to kind of deliver that. Should be able to let you do that. I've not forgotten the first part of the question. Sorry. Can you read the first part of the question, Megha?
Yeah, sure. Just give me 1 second. So this is from Melvi. What strategies would you use for identifying blockers?
Okay. So as I said, like if you this is the thing I was talking about, that if you are able to collect how users are navigating through your product, that gives you a very good idea of where the blockers are. So making sure that your product has very granular logs, etc., where you can figure out the insights, like that is very important. I think there's certain other, as you go sell to enterprise and all, there's certain other things that is very important, which is like, oh, is your product connected with their LDAP or Active Directory? Do you have granular role-based access control? These are things that become blockers very early. If you don't, if they cannot, support single sign-on, if your product can't support single sign-on, nobody will probably use it, right? That sort of thing. So in a more enterprise setting. But in the early days for registration, maybe just email registration works, right? So things like that. So one is, if you're looking at kind of the growth side, adding customers who may not be enterprise, figuring out in your product through analytics, looking at the usage, where the blockers are, and making sure you have the tools to do that. becomes very important, because different products might have different blockers, right? Whereas on the enterprise side, it is more around, what does a typical enterprise want and need? They don't want to be disturbed as much. They don't want to, because of this new product, they don't want to use a whole set of new tools. They want to continue using their existing tools. So how does your product work with these existing tools becomes very important. Right? So that'll be my short answer for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Deep, for such a wonderful session. And there are many more questions, and we need to pick a winner. So I think the fair way to do that is that I will share these questions with you, and I would request you to pick a winner for today. And thank you so much. We enjoyed your session. We hope to have such wonderful insights from you on another webinar,
Sure.
if time permits. And please accept the certificate of appreciation from our
Oh,
side.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So we have created a dedicated web page for you, and this is a Hall of Fame that we have created for you. Your webinar recording will be available here so that it helps a lot of people understand these concepts and learn. And for to the attendees, thank you so much for attending. And if you have more questions, please keep it coming on the LinkedIn threads where we can continue the conversation. I think that's a wrap for tonight. Deep, thank you so much for your time tonight, and we'll be in touch. And thank you again. Good
All
night,
right. Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Thanks for taking the time to listen to
Have
me.
a great
Thank you.
day.
Yeah. Bye-bye.